program on extremism. I'm also a lecturer at King's College London, and I'm one of the co-authors of the report we'll be discussing today called The Rise of the Reactionaries, comparing the ideologies of Salafi jihadism and white supremacist extremists. And I'm going to act as both a sort of discussant and moderator. So I'll just quickly introduce those who are joining us. Also thank our partners, the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology and Education Center, NSITE, for their assistance in the report. And joining me today is J.M. Berger, research fellow with Voxpol, a PhD candidate at Swansea University's School of Law, where he studies extremist ideologies. Blythe Crawford, one of the co-authors of the report, research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, where she specializes in far-right online social movements. Julia Ebner, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where she leads projects on online radicalization, disinformation, and hate speech. And Christopher Wall, a PhD student at King's College London, also where he researches and writes about global far-right extremism from a comparative perspective. All three of the panelists joining Blythe and I also formed or inspired a lot of our and informed a lot of our work in the report, and they're widely cited. So very interested to hear their own thoughts on it, maybe their critiques too. And I'll also just kick off by giving you a quick overview of the report, kind of why we did it, how we did it, and some of the important kind of takeaways. Not an easy thing to study, and hard to kind of find areas to focus on. And so we kind of started by reading some of the kind of emerging comparative literature, some of that coming from J.M., Julia, and Chris, to try to at least help us focus on areas to look at. And it kind of inspired for a number of reasons to do it. Firstly is kind of, there's been a wider, popular discussion about perhaps overlaps between these two forms of violent extremism that our societies are dealing with today. And this is emerging literature on trying to get a hold on really, is there enough of an overlap here to gain any real meaning from? Or is it just kind of a bunch of interesting observations? Or can we actually draw something from this? And that's kind of what we tried to do here. So reading the literature around it, around extremism, around these comparative studies, we started to draw a couple of similarities or things that we were noticing that were overlaps. And it's not just that they overlapped in how they look, but also in terms of the way that they were formulated. And that will make sense as I go along. The first thing that kind of jumped out to us as we kind of looking at the primary sources was that we were dealing with two movements that have very similar political impulse, right? And we've, as the title of the study suggests, that is essentially reactionary politics. These are two groups that are very concerned about the kind of relatively liberal progress that their societies have made over recent generations. And they're essentially trying to roll all of that back or undo it. And in a sense, they both actually do see Western liberal ideas as being fundamentally the problem. And even if you look at of course, white supremacists are very concerned with modern liberal ideologies, but in the end, if you look at what radical Islamists, earlier ones, Sayyid Qutb, Muslim Brotherhood, as well as even Imam Khomeini and Shia Islamists, they were in a sense were also responding to what they saw as a threat of Western liberalism in their own societies. So even though jihadists and Islamists are often dealing with their own societies, much of the ills of those societies are seen as coming from Western liberalism. And one of the things that, in terms of why this matters, is perhaps one of the things we suggest near the end, and this needs a lot more discussion, is, when we discuss the kind of waves of terrorism that we're in, and kind of one of the discussions that is ongoing within terrorism studies right now is, are we entering the right-wing kind of wave of terrorism, and leaving the religious wave behind, defined by jihadism and 9/11? And we're asked, perhaps, should we rethink that and actually look at this in a different way and consider actually the kind of rise of white supremacist violence is really of a piece with a wider reaction against liberal progress. If we break down, the history of terrorism alongside kind of Rappaport's four waves, the first three, the anarchist wave, the national determination wave, and the new left wave, these are all really one way or the other kind of revolutionary and to some extent inspired by left-wing ideas. It's only once we enter the religious wave that starts to change, and this is Rappaport's definition of the religious wave. But the question actually is, should we rethink that and not actually consider this the religious wave, but actually the reactionary wave, the wave of terrorism that is defined by rebelling against the progress of our societies, and this violent rebellion. And perhaps we should rethink that this form of terrorism we're dealing with in these terms, and as a reflection of wider phenomenon within a number of societies, people, wider popularity among populations for wanting to go back, as it were, rather than forwards. And so that's the kind of thing that interested us in terms of what brought them together. And then we started looking at some of the key components of the ideology to see what else we could find. And the next thing that kind of becomes quite obvious is these are groups that have developed a very strong sense of themselves and their collective identities, and they're highly chauvinistic in terms of how they view the out-group. Now, as JM has told us in his own work, one of the definitions of extremism is this idea of the in-group protecting it and being, violent or otherwise rejecting out-groups. But the idea of the in-group being inherently superior and should have some kind of form of supremacy over all others is quite unique to these two. And so this kind of chauvinistic nature of the in-group collective identity is clear in both movements. Of course, for the white supremacists, that is an identity built around race. For the jihadists, it is around religious interpretation. A big part of that identity as well, especially when it comes to terrorism and those being involved in terrorism, is hypermasculinity. They have very, very strong sense of male and female roles, but particularly obsessed with projecting strong male kind of heroes who are fighting back and willing to be violent against their enemies. What are they fighting back against? And that's the next thing we looked at, which is, of course, they're both heavily and very strongly driven by conspiracy theory. Now, again, this does not make them unique for extremist groups, but again, it's the nature of the conspiracy theory that they both follow that is actually very, very close together. They both have a very strong sense of an existential threat facing them. They both believe that they are going to be wiped out or in the process of being wiped out by an alliance of a number of out-groups, some of which they share in their hatred of. And I'll move on to that in a second. But so that existential conspiracy threat, which they both hold, again, in a way, it kind of is another thing that we notice as being quite an important overlap, and may again also help explain their appeal. A subcategory of that conspiracy theory, and we actually decided to make this a category on its own, but some would argue that this should have been in the conspiracy theory section, which is the anti-Semitism part. Again, anti-Semitism is not exclusive to jihadists or white supremacists, sadly. And we know that the far left certainly dabble in it as well. But the argument we make is anti-Semitism is inherent to jihadists and white supremacist ideology. It is part of their foundational DNA. You cannot take anti-Semitism out of these ideas and they will remain the same. I think we can talk about extremist leftists and from the Soviet Union onwards being anti-Semitic, but it's more of a weaponization or exploitation of underlying anti-Semitism in their societies. It's not an inherent part of their ideas. Whereas anti-Semitism seems to be, in our view at least, really inherent in both of them. And interestingly, actually here is the anti-Semitism of the jihad movement is not really much a product of their fundamentalism and their reading of the Quran and Hadith, but really is actually an import of European racism and anti-Semitism. If you look at the terms through which jihadists describe Jews, It's basically Nazi language, as well as inspired by things like the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Again, European racism. There's nothing in the Quran and Hadith which tells us that Jews have outsized power or behind the scenes controlling things. That is very, very much of a European concept. So actually, really, jihadists are, and if we look at Qutb, bin Laden, and ISIS, you can see very, very clear Nazi tropes in how they describe Jews. And we actually go into a little bit about Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Palestine, and his relationship with Hitler, and interestingly, a relationship which continues to be celebrated among a number of Salafis online. Actually, interesting, in a report we looked at last week, some of you who may have seen it, the Islamogram report, which looked at Salafis and who are appropriating alt-right imagery online. They make a lot of this relationship Amin al-Husseini had with Hitler. So the anti-Semitism being, in our view, is in a way unique to them in the sense that it's very much part of them. And one of the other, of course, important things is, what are they fighting for, and what is the long-term goal here? And they both have a very clear utopian project. Again, not something that is exclusive to them, but the nature of that utopia, I think, is actually quite similar. It's a utopia that is very concerned with purity, be it racial or religious. It's also and this is an area where I've had, and even Blythe and I have disagreed on in terms of the nature of the utopia. For me, these are two movements that are, in fact, if they were given power, the nature of the state that they would put together would most likely have to become totalitarian. I think for the jihadists, we've seen any opportunity they've had to take power, the nature of that state has pretty much been totalitarian. The last example being the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, a desire to have a say in as much of the aspect of people's lives as possible, because you cannot, in their view, society cannot really work unless everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet, socially, culturally, politically, and that requires a huge intervention on the side of the state. And I argue that for the white supremacists, in most cases, I don't think it's that possible to create a white supremacist ethno state without enacting totalitarian policies. Though I'm willing to I'm willing to debate that. But in my view, in the end, these are movements that are moving, and of course, authoritarian, but actually have a lot of totalitarian tendencies. And so that kind of obsession with purity, again, is something that is, in my view, in terms of the other extremist groups out there, is an obsession that is quite unique to these two. And I think I've gone on a bit longer than I should have, actually, so I will leave it at that. There's a lot to discuss, but I'll let Blythe take over and give us a little bit more insight, particularly on her own research and her thoughts on aspects of the kind of right-wing extremist component of this. Go ahead, Blythe.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so as Alex said, sort of my research very much focuses on the far right side of things. So that was what I was focusing on for this report. I think that one of the things that becomes kind of immediately apparent when we started looking at this comparison was just how kind of structurally different the two movements are, and how it is quite different to exactly focus on what parts of the ideology we wanted to compare. When we look at the far right, we see this very kind of fractured movement. It's very nebulous in a way that isn't so much kind of mirrored in the jihadist sphere. We see this sphere where there's kind of disagreements between different ideologies. A lot of these ideologies and movements kind of spring up from very vast sort of online spheres that are in various states of kind of ideological disarray. And even within kind of more cohesive movements, we see internal fracturing. I think an obvious example is with Atomwaff, when we've seen this kind of fracturing over recent years and disagreements to do with Satanism. So we've seen kind of this sphere that itself isn't structured by groups, and the groups themselves have a lot of internal disagreements. So we chose to kind of focus on the extreme right to kind of bring some kind of clear analysis to the piece. But we also found that it was important that we had to recognize kind of the extreme right's overlaps with the rest of the far right and its kind of interplay with the rest of society. Because if we're just focusing on one aspect of the extreme, we're kind of overlooking one of the main kind of strategic aspects of the far right, which is its kind of needs to shift the Overton window to have some interplay with the mainstream far right, and attempt to kind of shift what is acceptable towards this more kind of extremist worldview. And I think that we see a lot of ebb and flow between the extreme and the far right. And I think a good example of this that we use in the paper is looking at the Proud Boys. We see this very kind of front-facing, almost radical right side of the movement. And then once you peel back the layers and look at how they've kind of fractured, we see a side of the movement that is much more overtly white supremacist and embracing this more kind of extreme turn. So understanding this ebb and flow is really key to the far right success, and also speaks to one of the points that we emphasize in terms of identity building for the far right, which is its kind of reliance on subcultural practices and kind of internet culture. We focus on memes in the paper. So we look at how kind of memes are used to signal to the mainstream to kind of push, again, this Overton window of far right ideology further into the mainstream, as well as create a kind of in-group identity. And we see this kind of littered throughout far right and extreme right propaganda. We also see it in Tarrant's attack itself, the aesthetics of that attack, the Christchurch attack, and within his manifesto, he has this kind of famous quote where he says sort of memes have done more for the ethno-nationalist cause than any manifesto, which of course has a sort of hint of irony to it, but is also important when we're kind of understanding the importance of signaling back to these often online constructed, very tight-knit in-groups. And so we're also kind of seeing in the far right this kind of blurring between the importance of ideology and the kind of cultural sphere in a way that isn't so prominent on the jihadi side. And I think this kind of links to the section that we talk about in the kind of justification of violence between the two movements, where we've seen this far and extreme right be very prominent in kind of its use of the internet and its use of kind of culture for building its own identity. But we've seen it really kind of struggle to bring people into acts of kind of mass casualty violence. And this is something that we've seen the far right try to kind of learn from the jihadist side. Traditionally, the far right kind of relies on a lone wolf model, but they've had trouble getting people to kind of take up the reins into acts of violence. And so there's some envy with the jihadis. We've seen them attempt to kind of adopt tactics of jihadis using kind of the strategy of white jihad, which I think was furthered by kind of national action that we talk about in the paper, and kind of also sharing even ISIS and Al-Qaeda manuals throughout the far right. So we really see kind of an overlap between the two movements there. And I think that that becomes increasingly apparent and is something that we emphasize in this section of the paper when we're talking about accelerationism, which I think is important to kind of understanding this broader kind of reactionary wave. So accelerationism is sort of looking at this idea of understanding modern society as being irreparably and inherently kind of corrupt, and the only true or correct course of action being to kind of accelerate the existing tensions in society to the point of collapse, to sort of rebuild in the a new kind of utopia that white supremacists are backing. And so we see sort of supremacists like Tarrant, again, kind of furthers this idea of accelerationism. Within his own manifesto, he sort of calls for people to sow both discord from white supremacist and a jihadist point of view to kind of sow existing tensions in society and kind of accelerate panic in society. Atomwaffen and their kind of central text Siege is also somewhat fundamentally an accelerationist text. It repeatedly has calls throughout it to kind of accelerate tensions throughout society. And so we're kind of seeing this leaning on this kind of idea of accelerationism, where attacks, be they from the far right or the kind of jihadi side of things, are being celebrated for the essence and the inherent value of violence itself, and the kind of way in which violence can be inherently used to sow discord, and the use of this for both movements. We also see kind of the idea that, as Alex was saying, the utopias that both groups want to rebuild to being fundamentally quite similar in the things that they are prizing. In the report, we kind of stress this centrality of purity culture to both movements. And it's something I think I wanted to kind of stress was not only we're seeing this in terms of kind of blood and soil Nazis, but also in this very kind of highly gendered society. We see sort of strong men and kind of very traditional roles for women being kind of adopted and favored. There's a big intolerance to kind of what is seen as the corrupt modern gender roles of society. And again, this kind of plays into the far right's ebb and flow with the sort of mainstreams of society, where we're seeing kind of panic around sort of transphobia in the sort of mainstream. We're also seeing that very much reflected and being played to kind of the hand of the far right within these movements. We sort of see this in the phrase kind of reject degeneracy, embrace tradition being one of the biggest kind of phrases that is very much used by the far right. And I think an important note, just to follow on from this idea of the similarities in the utopias that both movements kind of look up to, is the reaction that we saw the far right have to the Taliban in Afghanistan this year, and kind of their overtaking of Afghanistan. In a lot of far right networks, there was ironically a kind of reverence and a kind of support for the kind of society that the Taliban wanted to institute in Afghanistan, particularly the kind of lack of giving women access to education was something that was really celebrated among the far right. And I think that's mostly what I wanted to kind of touch on. Just some kind of final remarks on this idea of this reactionary wave that Alex was kind of talking about. I think we're sort of seeing, as Alex was saying, this kind of Islamogram sphere where we're seeing sort of admittedly a fringe element of the kind of jihadi sphere learning from the alt-right and their aesthetics. We're also seeing the far right more broadly attempting to kind of learn from the jihadi side and kind of tactics. So there is, to some, at least small degree, an element of convergence and similarity between these two movements. And I think when we look at this through the lens of accelerationism and the idea of violence being celebrated purely for the importance of violence itself, I think that this convergence becomes increasingly important and is certainly something that we need to be kind of paying attention to. I think that kind of concludes what I wanted to talk about, so I'm happy to hand over to J.M. Berger for some further thoughts.
Thanks, Blythe. Just before you start, Jen, just to remind the audience, we're taking questions as well. In the Q&A box there at the bottom of your Zoom page, you should see a box that says Q&A. Feel free to put in questions as we're speaking, and we will deal with them once the last panelist finishes. Go ahead, Jan. Thanks.
Thanks for having me, and congratulations on this paper. It's really covers a lot of ground that I'm extremely interested in, and a very big picture sweeping look at this issue. I want to talk a little bit about some of the future directions for research that sort of are suggested out of this. So I think what we're getting at this point with this paper, with Julia's work, with Charlie Winter and Ashley Mathias's work, we're building up a pretty good body of comparison between white nationalism, American right-wing ideologies, and jihadism. And I think, as the paper notes, it's in some ways this is the low-hanging fruit, because they are very similar movements in a lot of ways. They have a lot of similar qualities, and I think, the next frontiers that we want to push back are to look at other kinds of movements that we consider to be extremists that are more diverse. So what I'm currently doing as part of my dissertation is I'm looking at the ideology of slavery in the United States prior to the Civil War. So what I'm finding there is that there's both shocking commonalities with modern white nationalism, as well as really dramatic differences. And the differences are often kind of structural in nature. One of the things that jihadism and modern white nationalism have in common is that they are, as I discussed in my recent paper on James Mason's Siege, they're very focused on critique of the in-group. So there's a lot of discussion about the deficiencies of the in-group, of the eligible in-group. So James Mason spends a lot of time talking about the problem with white people. Abdullah Azzam spends a lot of time talking about the problem with Muslims. What we see in the pro-slavery ideology is that there is much less discussion. It's a status quo. So it's a status quo ideology. Slavery is the law of the land. It's under attack, as opposed to modern white nationalism, jihadism, which are outsider ideologies. So what we see in the defense of the status quo is a much greater focus on the outgroup, on describing and enumerating the problems with the outgroup, and less emphasis on the problems with the in-group, because the status quo ideology is trying to heal the in-group in a lot of ways. They're trying to prevent the civil war, essentially, which they believe can only be done, that the Union can only be preserved by preserving slavery. So it's really fascinating in some ways. Structurally, the stuff that I focus on, which tends to be sort of like in-group, out-group, crisis solution, how do these linkages get built, sort of analytical approach that Aurora Ingram introduced. Structurally, they're very different, but content-wise, they're very similar in that a lot of the things that are being argued by these pro-slavery ideologues are very closely paralleled by modern white supremacists. So I think, there's a lot of room for us to look at diverse groups. I mean, the other thing that, and this always comes up in anytime anybody puts out a report like this, is, what about the left wing? And we do need to do that. And I'm at the phase in my dissertation where I'm struggling with whether to add more case studies or try and wrap things up. So I would like to get some left-wing content in there. I will at least acknowledge it, but we'll see how much there ends up being. I may have to stay in this zone because there's so much to say just in this space. But that's what postdocs are for, I guess. So really, I think this reactionary versus revolutionary distinction is something that's where we're really going to have to do more research. I think there's a lot more stuff to look at. Another question I think that arises out of this paper is sort of understanding the process of ideological diversity. So the white nationalism in its current form and the right wing in general is extremely ideologically diverse. It's really a collection of overlapping kind of ideologies, and even more than being one coherent ideology, as opposed to jihadism, which is much less ideological diverse. So there's definitely, we have splintering, we have differences of opinion, we have different organizations that are in competition with each other, but ultimately, there's very little variation in what jihadists believe relative to what white nationalists believe, because you can be a secular white nationalist, you could be a religious white nationalist, you could be a neo-Nazi, you could be Christian identity, you could be KKK. It's all just wildly different. So, I think there's sort of an interesting question, and what I'm seeing in the slavery defenses is that there's huge ideological diversity there too. So there's a question about why some movements are more ideologically diverse than others. It may have to do with their dominant status, or it may have to do with something else. I think that's an area that we could really fruitfully kind of delve into. I want to talk a little about also, I think that, something that's difficult to talk about in this space is origins, like how extremist movements form out of more ordinary social distinctions. And so what I am going to, while I still finalizing my case study selection for the dissertation, what I am going to do is, this was a subject of some negotiation to get this in there, is talk about the early splitting of Christianity from Judaism in the first couple centuries of Christianity, because I think there's some really kind of interesting examples of how early Christians first tried to recruit from Jewish communities and then later tried to separate from Jewish communities. And there's a, very sort of distinct progression of hostility toward Jewish communities that ultimately underlies a lot of the anti-Semitism that's talked about in this report. I mean, we can go back. There's something that sort of, the more I do this work, the more I see kind of through lines, whether they're parallel developments or direct, lineages of how ideological formation happens. But you can see qualities in this early content, especially when you get to the 3rd, 4th century, that has relevance to the problems and ideologies that we see today. So I think that's a really interesting area. And I think the gender piece, I'm glad to see the focus on this here. I think my interest in future research there is to see, I'd love to see some developmental psychology on gender in context of extremism, because I have a pet theory that I'm not qualified to really analyze, which is that how you learn about gender as the first identity that most people are introduced to, how you learn about gender affects how you process other identities later in life. So I'd love to see see us draft a developmental psychologist in to talk about, maybe if there's some issues that we can sort of fruitfully look at in there. And then the last point I'll just make is, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I may eventually write about, or maybe somebody else will, is in-group boundaries. One thing that this paper notes quite aptly is that one difference between jihadism and white nationalism is you can opt into jihadism, and you can opt into the in-group. You can join the in-group by converting, and you cannot join the white in-group. So that is something that is determined by the in-group consensus, and the in-group consensus is not totally fixed in the sense that it does change over time, over generations, the definition of who's white and who's part of that in-group, racial in-group. But in the moment, you cannot simply say, I'm going to become a white person, right? So I'm curious about this, because when you think about it kind of intuitively, you think that like a fluid in-group, might be less extreme than a group that has much more rigid boundaries. But in fact, you look at the example of ISIS, and it's very hard to make that case. So I'm curious about how the rigidity of the in-group boundary affects the ideology, and if there's any kind of useful threads we can pull on there. So these are a bunch of areas that I'm interested in seeing researchers tackle. I will be tackling several of them in my dissertation and beyond, and I hope to see what some of you all out there do with it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, JM. And I think, as you know, this kind of discussion actually throws up a lot more questions than answers. Again, to remind you in the audience, go ahead and throw questions into the Q&A box as and when. Go ahead, Julia. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And I think this is a really important report. And I've been passionately researching this topic since, I think, 2016. So basically since this wave of jihadist attacks that we had in Europe and also in North America that triggered an anti-Muslim far-right extremist response, and where they were able to really mobilize off the back of that. So that led me to write my first book, The Rage, which was about the parallels, but also the interactions between far-right extremist and jihadist movements. And what was really interesting to me, because I did go undercover with some of the movements on both sides of the ideological spectrum. And what was interesting was that I always heard the same type of stories. The patterns were always the same. And as you make very clear also in the report, really the same enemies are highlighted. So, of course, in the case of both the jihadists and the white nationalists, we have a clear anti-democracy rhetoric, but it's really an anti kind of elite rhetoric, but also an anti-Semitic rhetoric that is present in both, misogynist, as has been mentioned several times now. So there are definitely lots of overlaps in the enemies. And that also means that they play into each other's hands, because also the narratives are quite similar. And you also mentioned this already, but of course the narrative is always that of an inevitable war, which also gives rise to this accelerationist idea that both of them are trying to bring forward this inevitable war by staging terrorist attacks, by really escalating the already existing societal tensions to bring about this war while they still feel to be in the majority, or they feel to be more powerful than maybe 10 years down the line. So they both have this dystopian vision of a day X that is coming, or of the end of time, the end of times in the jihadist case, that they have to bring about faster. And so I would say accelerationism, we always talk about accelerationism when talking about far-right extremist, white supremacist groups, but it's pretty much the same as the defensive jihad idea. And it's really, I think there's a big similarity or even an overlap in that, because by then also staging these terrorist attacks, they would of course help each other by making the idea that, oh, actually the Muslims are, the idea that the far right is portraying the Muslims or the non-white whites are trying to wipe us out, they're an existential threat to our existence, that would be more credible. And on the other hand, the jihadists would say, oh, look at all these far right extremists that are staging attacks on innocent Muslims, that are trying to invade us, to take over our countries and to wipe us out. So they both really help each other in that, in staging attacks against each other, and also in staging attacks against the political middle and against democratic institutions, because by wiping out that political middle ground and by undermining trust in democratic institutions, they also help all the radical sides that there are. They also help other radical movements, but they really help each other, and that is also interesting in the light of actually some instances of collaboration between jihadists and far-right extremists. So when looking, for example, at the attacks, the hostage taking that took place in the suburbs of Paris just right before the Charlie Hebdo attack, there was actually there were jihadists that took the people in that kosher supermarket, in the Jewish supermarket, hostage, and they got their weapons from a white nationalist in the north of France. So there was even a collaboration here, and that is something that we can also sometimes observe, that there is this interplay, especially when looking at the dark net and when looking at where they actually get their weapons from. They would, of course, sometimes cross each other's paths, and they would sometimes even collaborate, because their enemies, as I mentioned earlier, and as was also highlighted in the report, often overlap. And another maybe interesting dimension here is that because of the unique offers that both the jihadist groups and the far-right extremist groups make to new members, creating exclusive subcultures, gamifying their propaganda. Both of them do that in very sophisticated ways, and actually communicating, yes, very backward ideologies, but in a very sophisticated, forward-looking manner. That's something they also have in common. And because they're so good at that, that also means that they can both recruit young audiences. Their main target group is Generation Z. And it also means that sometimes, because of that similarity also in the identity they give to new members, or in that exclusive group identity, we have seen some cases of even neo-Nazis all of a sudden leaving their neo-Nazi networks and actually going to join ISIS. So they're so similar to some extent that there are people who are willing to basically first fight for one group and then change to the completely other side. And I think that also shows what we're dealing with here, that the identities and the narratives are, and in general, the offers also of this whole gamified, hyper exclusive, very social spaces that they create is a very, unfortunately, a very appealing one, especially to young people. Maybe just one last dimension I want to mention, because I know we've talked mainly about ideologies because the report is on ideologies, but it is very interesting to see that also the tactics in terms of staging attacks, not just in terms of launching propaganda and communication campaigns, are very similar. So there have been, of course, waves of copycat jihadist attacks that we saw in Europe and also in North America in recent years, but there has been a similar wave on the far-right extremist sides of inspirational terrorism, where the attack that Brenton Tarrant launched in Christchurch has really inspired a whole series of attacks where the perpetrators all mentioned him, and where these networks, these online networks, glorified Brenton Tarrant to the extent that there was almost a competition for higher scores, and that attackers were painted as martyrs and put on the covers of video games in a very similar manner that ISIS glorified their attackers as martyrs and heroes. So that is one of the main dangers I also want to highlight for the future, where I think copycat DIY terrorism is really a trend that we're seeing on both sides. And yeah, I'll leave it here, but I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks very much. Again, any questions, put them in the Q&A box. Go ahead, Chris. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on this panel. So everybody seemed to have talked about like the tactical aspects of like the modern far right in comparison to jihadism, but I worked with Walter LaCour right before he died, so I was influenced a lot. So I want to respond a lot to the thesis that Alex and Blythe advanced about maybe reconceptualizing this fourth wave away from like this religious component to a reactionary component, which I think has a lot of validity. So Walter LaCour, he wrote the first book on terrorism, if you will. And so he traced the origins of terrorism to like the French Revolution, the values like nationalism, democracy, and sort of like these emancipatory ideals. And you sort of see this like in the first three waves that Alex highlights. And in some ways, they were sort of like advancing modernity. It was the question of like, let's fight despotism, let's break away the power of the religious political elite, let's fulfill these ideals of nationalism and give people self-determination. And what's interesting, I would argue, is that for the most part, those ideals have sort of been accommodated by, let's say, the modern state system that sort of emerged since the French Revolution. Like the left, like with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you sort of see this idea that you can redistribute, you can address the inherent contradictions in capitalism. Whereas the wave that Alex talks about, which I think is really valid and which is something that I've been sort of researching in my own work, is really just like a fight against modernity. And so someone else that sort of influenced this thought, like I remember Walter talking about this a lot towards the end of his life, was George Mossey's research into the origins of National Socialism and Nazism. And so there you sort of see the ideas of like the Volk. And so it's sort of something that Alex and Blythe talk about, like this looking back onto this heroic age and trying to like rebirth, like it's something that exists in both the modern far right and jihadist ideology. So you look back to this heroic age where men were men and women had a traditional role. And what George Mossey found at the time was that a lot of this was a response to industrialism. And you can sort of trace it back today, like let's say this modern version to globalization. So what industrialization did was really displaced like the peasant or the worker, and it sort of reduced the cosmos or changed the cosmos. Reduce is probably the wrong word, expanded the cosmos and basically made humanity insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And so whereas before you had political religious elites that controlled the sciences, that controlled the arts, and sort of gave humanity purpose, like your purpose was defined by functionalism, where you fit in the strata. So science was no longer confined to religious truth, so was art, and so was these advancing these ideals. And so you had a sort of reactionaries in 19th century Germany, and you sort of see this as well here in the United States, like the far right here, that looked upon this mythic past where there was purity and like men were able to establish themselves through like masculinity and hyperviolence and strength, and that was really like inherently made you better. So it goes to sort of Jay and Berger's point where like the in-group out-group dynamic, it was like there wasn't something inherently good about who you were, and you sort of see these dynamics as well with like jihadist ideologists, like where being part of this religious community inherently gives you value, it gives you worth. And so now in like this globalized world where you sort of see like the strictures of industrialization going, like affecting everybody. And let's say this was a term that was popular in the 90s, but the global village, like we're no longer confined to these same geographic bounds. Like you now have like different cultures and civilizations touching upon, like I don't want to sound too Huntington in this regard, but it sort of challenges like these precepts that you could have had like this crucible where people's identity were still sort of like, you still had these religious ideas coming forth. And so I think in many ways, that's basically a better way to conceptualize what we've seen since 1979, which is like this reactionary wave where we want to go back to a world where there was no liberal democracy, where even the nation state, the Leviathan, wasn't the arena for political debate or conflict, if you will, and where things weren't resolved and like you didn't have to prove your worth simply because, I mean, in both sense, like I guess like one of the things I always notice is this idea of like there's this spiritual hierarchy that comes forth, like whether you're white, there's always this desire to like with like far rightists, it's like this desire like to prove that you're not Jewish, that you're not this, you're not that. And can you trace your lineage back to the Aryans? Like, can you be Germanic? Can you be, and even further, can you can you disassociate yourself from Christianity, which is also seen as a Semitic religion in certain circles, and be even more pure? And because that's strength, that's vitality. So there's something inherent worthwhile with your bloodline. And you see this as well with jihadist ideology, that this simple belief, it gives you value, it gives you purpose. And as the universe becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, you still have purpose and desire. So that's really something that I think is unique and really interesting about this paper. And I think that merits further response, which is sort of like, there's like a policy question to this, which is if the first three ways were really accommodated by the current political system, or like the norm that because of the French Revolution, you had politics of consensus, if you will. I'm not sure that you can necessarily accommodate these politics, or like the politics, like these reactionary politics, within the modern framework that also respects gender, that reflects religious plurality, basically respects freedom of expression. And I think that's something that really that really merits further discussion. Now, something I'd like to, which I think is really important, breaking apart anti-Semitism from like the broader conspiracism. So I know like I'm the last one, so I don't have too much time, but I think the anti-Semitic component is really important too, just because if this was a European creation and it was exported to the rest of the world, why was it a European creation? Like, why were Jews seen as this inherently evil? And it was because they were seen as the face of the capital. If you, again, looking back at 19th century Germany, where like National Socialism like really relied upon this, there was this desire to be connected to the land, to the Volk, to the territory. There was something spiritually enlightening about that. Whereas Jews, just because of history and constructs and this artificial image, if you will, were always seen as rootless. They were seen as bourgeois. They were seen as not part of the people. And you can even trace this back to the French Revolution itself, where there was a lot of conspiracy theories about the Illuminati and how there was Jewish thought with Spinoza, and how that sort of basically they were the ones that foisted upon the world the French Revolution, the evils, and then the turmoils and then instability that you saw throughout the 19th and 20th century. And being able to trace that, like, I think that's incredibly valid. So I know we're like reaching upon time, so I just want to pause here, and I'm happy to elaborate further during Q&A.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks everyone. And I think one of the questions we ask is usually terrorism is a reflection of a wider kind of underlying driving force within society, and it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg of something that's going on more widely. And so what does it tell us that these two reactionary chauvinistic groups are having this success at the same time, in the same parts of the world, or at least in the West? What is it telling us about what our societies need and which direction they're going? And I'm not sure it's telling us a very positive, or telling us a very positive message about that. What is it? They're both, as Julia said, they're both offering quite similar things. And why are those offers today so apparently attractive? And that might help us in the wider question of doing something about this. Is if we can understand what the essence of the appeal of these two groups, which seems to be quite similar, perhaps we can start getting or improving our sense of what we can do to undermine that appeal. And I just I was going to ask one question, and then I'll from the audience. One thing that we didn't talk about, but in the report, but I wanted to, wasn't sure how to deal with, was this question of, and it's in the area of tactics more than anywhere else, is this question of manifestos compared to, say, right-wing manifestos, which has kind of defined a lot of right-wing terrorism. I know JM has written about that, and compared to the kind of suicide video or martyrdom video. I don't know if you have any thoughts on those being comparable, or why it appears that maybe the manifesto in extreme right-wing terrorism seems to play perhaps a stronger role in that. Do you think in encouraging future terrorism?
Sure. I can hit both of those questions kind of you just raised. On the just I'll be very brief on the first part. I think that there's a good body of research that shows that uncertainty, both social and personal uncertainty, make people more susceptible to extremist belief. And communications revolutions, technological progress, increasing global networks, complexity of global networks, all these things really create an environment of great uncertainty, even before you get to the pandemic and the terrorism and the nascent fascism. So I think it's pretty understandable that we're seeing a lot of activity in this area right now. On the manifestos, I think the ideological diversity question comes into play here. Is manifestos, what you see is a lot of people sort of the written form has and the fact that they're issued by an individual rather than being laundered through an organization means that these manifestos are all kind of bespoke or very original contributions. They have an ideological component to them. They often are sort of describing how the person understands the ideology as opposed to representing the official or group ideology. So there's a weird kind of evolutionary thing that happens in these manifestos that doesn't happen in like a suicide video, which is much more formulaic. And if I got on a suicide video and started talking about gray aliens, the terrorist group just won't release it. So, I think that there's definitely like a sharp break between those two genres of expression. I think the suicide video is very sort of formal, ritualistic thing, and the manifesto is much more complex and interesting ultimately.
That's very useful. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add on the panel to that.
Yeah, I'll just. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Blythe, and then Chris. Yeah, just real quick, and I want to take some questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that quickly. I think it relates to something that Julia was saying as well about this kind of wave on the far right of copycat or inspirational terrorism. I think the far right is very aware that it has this kind of tactical lag behind the jihadis and that it is difficult to inspire people into terrorism from that cause, and that lone actor attacks on their own are not always valued unless they're kind of followed up by a further wave of violence to get this kind of look at significance of kind of significance. And so I think a lot of the importance of far right manifestos is in A, explaining the ideology, and B, attempting to inspire further acts of violence, C, to kind of pitch themselves as kind of martyrs to the wider far right to kind of get this wider status within the far right online ecosystem. That will eventually encourage other people into similar martyrdom, which I think is also why we see the far right manifestos often being somewhat off the wall and kind of filled with memes to signal it back to this in-group as well. And I'll pass over to Chris.
So I agree with everything that was said. I think I still fall back onto like the old propaganda of the deed. So I mean, I think they're just similar. I mean, like yes, like in components, like obviously they have to address the audience, but I mean, if you go out and kill somebody or you shoot up a mosque, like without really giving context, like it's really hard to draw attention to your cause and as to why you did it. And similar to a martyr video, you're still giving a cause and trying to reach other people and trying to inspire and try to motivate. So I think that component's still there and like they should be studied similarly.
Okay, thank you. So the first question, the audience was from Shelby, which I think is one that applies to, I think, all of your research, but are there any similarities around how both groups groom, foster, and recruit members, particularly youth, both male and female, in relation to methods and messaging acts required to demonstrate commitment? I mean, I think all of you have to some extent researched that one aspect of that or another. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think maybe just a few words on that. I do think that gamification is a key word here. Both of them have really gamified their recruiting, their propaganda and messaging methods. I think that's really something where they're particularly good at grooming Generation Z. And especially also by, this has already been highlighted now, but by really turning previous perpetrators, previous influential figures into heroes, into glorified figures especially in online networks. That's something that we can observe on both sides, and where they used a lot of pop culture references, even the jihadists, and well, both of them actually, interestingly, because they both have various conspiracy theories about Hollywood, about like all of this Western propaganda machine, as they would call it. But at the same time, they use some of these pop culture references in order to make it more appealing to young members to not just be part of an online community, but also to put their words into action, to join ISIS in Syria and Iraq, as what they did with their propaganda. It's very similar to some of the calls to join groups to join white nationalist groups in their white jihad. And I think it's just the visuals, looking at the glossy materials we saw in ISIS the Big magazine, it's very similar what we see in white nationalist propaganda magazines from Atomwaffen or National Action propaganda. They sometimes even copied and imitated they copied and imitated ISIS propaganda, and even the training camps were very similar.
Thank you, Julia. Anyone else wanted to look a bit at particularly maybe the way that they operate online? I think is that part of that question was, the way they recruit online. Are there similarities or differences that any of you have noticed on that?
There are definitely some similarities, but I think that, a problem that we have with studying the online spaces, or making generalizations about them rather, not studying them, is that there's just like so much, really rapid change in how these communities function due to the pressure they're under from content moderation, and due to the different social contexts of that pressure. So, I think we all know that it's no secret that these companies have been much more effective wiping out ISIS supporters from the online space than they have been from neo-Nazis, for a lot of reasons, including, a biased approach to this, where white people get a different kind of treatment than brown people, and linguistic and other kinds of issues. It's not quite as simplistic as that, but I think there was a point at which you could sort of look at the behaviors that they were converging. Like you could see like very similar kind of converging strategies, and now it's really, everything's just kind of all over the map. So there are certainly elements of how they stalk and groom online, but I think that it's very hard to pull any generalizations at this point in the process.
Yeah. Alex, if you don't mind me jumping in too, I agree with JM that really is just a generalization. I think but I think there's more differences than similarities, even though people want to try to like use analogies just because analogies are very useful, or like they help us simplify the world. But I mean, one of the key things that at least like jihadists can sort of fall back onto is that at some point in the recent history, they actually had a physical place they can sort of bring in people. And so that sort of allowed that type of recruitment and messaging. Whereas online space, because there isn't a safe place for white nationalists, if you will, even though people want to claim Idaho and try to create like this ethno-nationalist state up in the Pacific Northwest, it's still just an imaginary concept, and you can still have offline communication and contact, but operating online, because you're hidden, like you don't really have a face or a picture, it's a very different messaging and communication style. So you sort of have to ground your propaganda to be part of a cause for some utopia, as a report sort of talked to, whereas like ISIS or people that are ISIS adherents can at least say like, hey, we had our utopia until like the West conspired against us and sort of destroyed it. And so then you sort of have all these other offline spaces. And I think that's something that's very important, is just to like, as we continue with like terrorism research is just to like, online is really easy to like draw comparisons, but don't like the kith and kin contact is still very important for understanding recruitment strategies and communication, and also radicalization.
Thank you. Just running over a bit, I'm going to take one more question, and this is on the issue of what policies and how this may inform CVE policy in particular. The question from David is: could your research point at similar ways to use counter messaging and de-radicalization towards both ideologies? And that's a difficult one. I think one, the instinct would be, well, because they have these underlying overlaps, that the way to respond to them perhaps should be also the same, or the same, should fall under the same policy umbrella. But probably the truth is that actually the population that you're going to be interacting with in terms of who each movement is attracting are going to have quite different frames of reference. They may well have quite different socioeconomic statuses and different experiences within their own society. So actually, I would be loath to say that because, though I argue they have very, very similar underlying messages, they probably, the effort to counter it needs to be tailored to each movement more specifically. I don't know what anyone else thinks about that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Alex. I think the underlying psychological factors are the same, or are very similar. Obviously, the vulnerabilities are the same. So speaking in terms of psychological messaging, I think there are definitely learnings that we can take, for example, from counter messaging that we apply to jihadist movements that we can learn for the alt-right or for white nationalist movements. But at the same time, it is true that the language each of these subcultures, especially in the far-right extremist space, speak, that really needs to be incorporated in the messaging, because I don't think we get anywhere with the kind of generic counter communications campaigns that we ran against ISIS, because they would just be ridiculed. And we did a few assessments also at ISD of counter messaging that really failed, where especially the far right they had a laugh, basically. They just completely ran their own campaign to counter the counter messaging campaign. And I think that's a real danger. And that means that especially within the far right extremist subculture, we need to take into account the vocabulary they use, the subculture jokes and memes and references and so on, and really make sure that's incorporated. I think fun and entertainment and trolling are a lot less prevalent in the jihadist space than they are in the far right extremist space.
I would just add, I think that a lot of my work has been really very specifically aimed at creating a context to do comparative study of extremist movements. And there are a lot of reasons to do that. If we accept that there is a thing called extremism that can be coherently defined, then the question is, what makes a movement extremist versus not extremist, and what commonalities are there among different kinds of extremist movements? So when we can cut away some of the superficial stuff in terms of the contents of the ideology, like, whether you believe in, something about the Garden of Eden or something about, the apocalypse, and really kind of get into what the social dynamics that are stipulated by an extremist ideology or that play out in an extremist community. When we understand the things that are universal, the things that cut across all these different ideologies, those are, it seems to me, are the things that we should be focused more on. So we're not necessarily, trying to do counter messaging that sort of hits it, every little bit of ideological incoherence that a group has, but really to sort of say, what are the most important dynamics in extremism? What makes an extremist movement extremist, and what makes an extremist movement violent versus a movement that's not violent? And so, the more we study these things across ideological boundaries, I think you're bound to find insights that will help with counter messaging and counter radicalization.
Thanks very much, JM. Chris or Blythe, did you want to add anything else to that?
I guess I would just add that I very much agree that a lot of the kind of emotional drivers behind radicalization are these kind of extremely base human emotions. So kind of understanding these as a universal kind of driver is very important. I think I would also very much agree with what Julia was saying about sort of needing to understand the very specific subculture of the far right in order to tackle this. I think that's something I would just add more so on the kind of broader policy perspective from the point of view of the far right, is that although prescription isn't this perfect tool, it is the tool that we are kind of using in the UK. And I think that in order to accurately and properly counter the far right, we need to kind of see that being stepped up in the way that we're using that. We're quite consistently seeing groups being prescribed after they've disbanded, or we're seeing groups like Order of Nine Angles not be prescribed still, even though we know that they're very involved in kind of the UK far right scene. And I believe they have already been prescribed in places like Canada, and particularly when we're seeing, as JM was saying, this incredibly fast-paced, evolving far right landscape, and a lot of groups being highly networked with a lot of overlap between them in the far right sphere. Using prescription quickly and accurately with the far right is something that we're falling behind on at the moment, and it would be great to see that stepped up on the broader kind of policy side of things.
Alex, I'll just add one thing. I think that in terms of policy prescriptions, like at least from the United States, it's really hard. Just like, for one, the far right's very fractured. But I think one of the issues, and I would say this is I don't want to say it's universal, but at least a lot of far right thinking has sort of been sanctioned by institutional actors. I mean, I can't forget when Donald Trump at Charlottesville basically said that there was good actors on both sides. So like, how are you supposed to create a counter message to that when you have like the president of the United States sort of saying like, hey, this is cool, or same with during the debates last year, basically telling the Proud Boys to stand by and refusing to renounce white supremacy. And this is like that top-down level radicalization that Walter and I sort of talked about in our book, where you have institutional support for this, whether it's like legitimate political actors sort of taking advantage of freedom of speech and sort of saying like, hey, these beliefs, these chauvinistic beliefs and ideas, like we're sort of for that and we want to promote that in our policies. I would say, at least in the West, like when it comes to jihadist messaging, like there isn't that type of top-down state sanction. There's freedom of religion and freedom of speech, but there's nobody out there saying like, you don't have Donald Trump saying like, let's go wage jihad. So I'm not sure how you're supposed to. So yeah, the messaging has to be, in my opinion, has to be curated specifically for each actor.
I would just add to that. I mean, I think that one of the distinctions between jihadist milieu and the far right milieu is the jihadists have charismatic leadership that is sort of universally acclaimed and that provides an anchor for the movement to cohere around. And the difference between jihadist charismatic leadership and far right charismatic leadership up to and including Donald Trump is ideological coherence. So, you know, with some obvious points of disagreement and departure, you know, what Osama bin Laden versus Ayman Zawahiri versus, you know, Abdullah al-Muhajir are saying are mostly the same things. They're really very closely related, synchronized messages, whereas and they say what they're saying. They don't, it's not dog whistles, it's not code, it's not illusions, you know, they're just come right out and say what they're saying. So with the far right, and particularly in the United States, I think more than in Europe, what you have is really just, there's a lot of you know, illusion, hinting, indirectness, and you have, as I've written, Donald Trump is a figure that a lot of the far right in the United States has cohered around, but not like Osama bin Laden. It's not a case where you have somebody who's clearly articulating a coherent ideological program and people are getting behind it. It's more a general enthusiasm for somebody who looks like he's trying to burn the system down. So
yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks again, all our panelists. Thanks also to our other co-author, by the way, who's not with us here, Valentine Woodcup. Also the team at the Program on Extremism, Andrew Mines, John Lewis, Lorenzo Vedino, Deborah Margolin, and Seamus Hughes. And also our partners again at the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center and site. And also for the audience joining us, thanks very much. And we'll leave it at that. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.